A while back I released an exposure test looking at Portra 160. Today we're doing the same thing but with my go-to black and white film stock, Ilford HP5. I shoot a lot of Ilford HP5, largely because it's the cheapest and most readily available black and white film stock for me to purchase here in the UK. So because of that, I shoot it so regularly, and I wanted this stock to be the second in my little mini series testing out the exposure latitude of film. For this test, the same as with the Portra 160, I shot one roll of Ilford HP5 through my Pentax 6.7 and the 75mm lens. The image that I used for this test was the same simple composition of my conservatory that I shot on Portra 160, and so I got the sun shining into the conservatory, creating some very bright highlights and some deep shadows. This worked pretty well for the Portra 160 test, and as I said in that one, I'm hoping to complete a lot of these exposure tests with various film stocks to compare what they're like, and so having that same composition I feel like is going to give me the best point from which I can contrast and compare. I rated the HP5 at the box speed of 400, which is exactly what I did with Portra 160. I probably wouldn't normally do that. Typically I rate my HP5 one stop overexposed, so at 200, so hopefully this video will prove whether that is a good decision or not. Time to check out the completely unedited scans that I got back from my lab and compare the varying degrees of under and overexposure to the base correctly exposed image. As the same with the other ones, the lab probably tries to compensate a little bit and get a well exposed image, but you can see how a lab may handle this film stock if you under or overexpose it with these images. Ilford HP5 actually deals with overexposure and to an extent underexposure far better than I thought that it would. With this being a black and white film stock, we of course don't get any huge colour shifts like we do in Portra 160, it's simply a case of seeing how well the film retains highlights and shadow detail. In the case of HP5, I think it does this very well. Clearly it does handle overexposure better than it does underexposure, but at 1 and 2 stops underexposed, I was surprised to see that the image was actually still quite pleasing to the eye just from the base scan from the lab. All 4 stops of overexposure I think look really good, and it seems like you don't actually lose too much data in the highlights even when you are really pushing and overexposing this film stock. It still has a pleasing highlight roll off into the pure whites and obviously has the benefit of a lot more information and a clean image in the shadows when you do overexpose it. Because these negatives were of course black and white, I did actually also add a second step for this video where I took the black point of each exposure down to a similar level just to see what that would do to each image. I wanted to compare where that would place the rest of the tones in the image and see how or if this massively affected the look of each exposure. Let's take a look. This didn't actually massively alter the look of the overexposed images. They already largely had a pretty correct black point, and so they still all look great, but it does perhaps show a little better the slight increase in shadow detail as you get more and more overexposed. As for underexposure, this does of course show the real downsides of underexposing negative film. At 1 and 2 stops underexposed, the images again looks pretty good. They have a more unique look, I would say, than the overexposed images, and definitely show slightly more differences. I'd personally be okay shooting like this at 1 or 2 stops underexposed. However, at 3 and 4 stops underexposed, I did start to lose a lot of information in the shadows and just get an overall much more contrasty image when I balanced the black points. 3 stops under is marginally acceptable for me, but 4 stops under is something that I just don't think I would ever aim to shoot. I did also try and edit the images to get them as close back to the base exposure as possible to see what can be recovered from the different exposures. So let's take a look at how that went. I think in terms of editing, the overexposed images could almost all be pretty easily brought back down to achieve a similar look to the base correct exposure. If I was really worried about underexposing my image and wanted to retain a lot of that shadow detail, I think I'd feel confident shooting 3 stops or maybe even 4 stops overexposed. And surprisingly, even the underexposed images were actually quite workable to get back to a decent point. 1 and 2 stops underexposed can be made similar to the base exposure pretty easily, and it wasn't too hard. And even at 3 stops underexposed, you can get a really nice looking image that just has a slight loss of shadow detail. It just gets a little bit muddy in those shadows. 4 stops underexposed, however, I do think it's just a step too far. But clearly it's a pretty forgiving film stock in terms of the latitude, either end, overexposure or underexposure. So in conclusion, as with Portra 160, it is definitely best to err on the side of overexposure, and I personally will be shooting HP5 at 1 or maybe even 2 stops overexposed in the future to really try and retain as much detail as possible in those shadows. However, I do think that there's merit to shooting HP5 underexposed, which is something that I couldn't really say for Portra 160, particularly at around 2 to 3 stops underexposed. If you're creatively going for quite a grungy and faded black look, I think it looks really quite cool, and you might be really happy with the results that you get from underexposing by 2 or 3 stops. Let me know your thoughts on this little comparison below, or if you have any personal experience shooting HP5 and have some thoughts that you want to share, please do. If you liked the video, feel free to give me a like and subscribe if you want to see more from me in the future. Stay safe everyone, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.